special equipment. Language is transmitted by humans. Even if you're using computers to transmit it, in terms of memory and bandwidth, it's trivial to move little snippets of text around. And also, your name, the name of your company, the name of your product, is really the most important verbal message you're going to be creating in business when you think about it, because it's going to be often the very first thing that people will learn about you. It's going to be the thing that is most often repeated about your company or your product. And it's going to be simply kind of the mental hook on which people are hanging the identity of your company or your product, the brand, right? And so it really plays an important role for your customers, your potential customers, and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the naming process. I'm not checking my email while I'm talking. I actually have my notes here on my phone, so I'm going to refer to those. All right, so some of the local companies that I've been involved in as a naming consultant are Gist and Zulily, if you're familiar with those. Okay. All right, so when you're thinking about naming, there's really a practical side that you have to consider, and there's the creative side, right? And on the practical side, you have all the sort of constraints that you have to deal with. Like, for example, do you need a domain name? Do you need a .com domain name? Do you have to get a trademark? Is it necessary for you to use certain words in the name of your company or your product? Is it necessary for you to avoid certain words? Is your name going to be used to capture search engine traffic through searches on generic phrases, for example? All of these are going to determine, first of all, what kind of a name is desirable, and also what kind of a name is possible for you. For example, so if you're using your name to capture search engine traffic, then it's probably a good idea to look at a generic phrase, the sort of phrase that somebody would type into a search engine. That's kind of a special case. If, however, you're counting on your name to create a brand and to get mind share, to get into people's heads, to get people talking, then you really need to have a name that's brandable. And those are the kinds of names that I really focus on the most. Okay. So that's the kind of name that's going to help you get noticed and remembered, and that's going to help to bring interesting ideas and feelings into the brand that you're building for your company or your product. Okay. You have to consider, if you're thinking about a brandable name, you have to consider questions like, do you expect people to hear the name before they see it, for example? If that's true, then you have to think about having a name that's really easy to spell. Are people going to be, do you think, sharing the name over the phone? Are they going to be are you counting on having a lot of word of mouth, literal word of mouth with people talking to each other? If so, the spelling issue is really important. Think about a name that somebody can easily spell correctly if they hear it. If, on the other hand, your name, you expect it to be seen in web ads, search results, print ads, then the spelling issue might not be quite so crucial. But of course, it's always a good idea to have a name that's easy to spell if you can get it. All right, and now let's turn to the sticky issue of the domain name, because this is an issue that everyone needs to make a decision about right from the outset, or they're destined for heartbreak. So the question you have to ask is, do you have a budget for buying a domain name that somebody else has registered and they're trying to resell? If you don't have such a budget, then you can rule out having a name that is a single word of English, like Amazon, Twitter, Gist, because these names have all been registered and they're all on the resale market for thousands of dollars. So if you want to get a name like that, or if you want to get even a really common and short phrase, you have to be prepared to spend thousands of dollars to acquire it. If you don't have that money for a name, for starters, then you have to get creative, and then you have to think of different kinds of names that can work for you. All right. So now let's consider that more creative side of naming. Naming, first of all, is really a conceptual issue. When you start out, it's conceptual, because you have to think about what it is that it's really important to convey about your company or product to people who know nothing about it, right? And so when I do a naming project, I define what I call some message goals for the project. That's the first thing I do. I talk to the client, I get all the stuff I need that they want to tell me about what they're trying to do. And then the message goals are ideas and feelings that you would like the name to, in some way, bring up in people's minds. And message goals are really, they should be really very simple. Each message goal, you should be able to state it in a word, a couple of words, or a really short phrase. So they need to be simple. And then also, crucially, they need to be of the right granularity. So if you have decided that your message goals are things like quality, or value, or best, or something like that, these are the kinds of things that everyone would want to deliver, and everyone would want to communicate. Those message goals are too broad. So if you're saying something that you believe everyone would want to say, then your message goals are too broad. If, on the other hand, you are aiming at ideas that are so specific that people don't even know why you're mentioning them, like, a classic example would be some sort of a technical specification of your product that most people are not familiar with the function of, then your message goals are too specific. So there's this conceptual work that has to go into the beginning of the naming process, which is identifying message goals of the appropriate granularity. Not too general, not too specific, just the right level to be informative to people and still be interesting to them. Okay? All right. And now, in addition to message goals, then the next step that I do in a process is thinking about communication strategies. And this is really just different ways to achieve the message goals that you've identified. Because once you have these concepts that you're working with, there are different ways you can convey those to people, right? You might name them as directly as you can. You might find a word that sort of literally names the concept you have in mind. Or you might convey them indirectly using some sort of images, metaphors, other kinds of associations. Or you might even, in some cases, leave a message goal out of a name entirely and convey it using other visual elements of your branding. And these are decisions that you need to make at the beginning. Now, the idea of communicating indirectly is, to me, this is really the key of good naming. Because direct communication, that is finding words that will just directly and literally say the message goals that you have in mind, there's a little bit of a problem with that. And the problem has to do with what I call the search for relevance. And the search for relevance is really the idea that if somebody hears about what your company is doing or what your product is, and they hear the name, subconsciously, they're going to be thinking, how does that name relate to what they do? It doesn't even have to, they don't have to really be aware that they're doing it. They're going to be looking, they're trying to connect the dots. There's a search for relevance. And this is really like a part of all human communication, of looking for relevance. The search for relevance is really what makes communication possible. Somebody says something, or someone even does something, some sort of a communicative action or gesture. The way you are able to identify the communicative intent is by thinking about the relevance. How is this relevant to our interaction? How is it relevant to our relationship and what's going on right now? And the same is really true with naming. So when you're naming, there's a search for relevance that takes place to connect the name to the thing it names. And if the name is too close to what it names, then the search for relevance, if you think of that as a journey, it's too easy. It's like a trip to the grocery store. It's short and you don't see anything very interesting along the way. On the other hand, if you have an indirect connection between the name and what you're naming, you see interesting things. There's interesting territory that you go through. And that sort of interesting mental territory is the stuff that becomes the beginning of your brand. So let's just take, and here's an example. I often use it, but it's a good example, and so I like to talk about it, and that is the name Apple, Apple Computer. What are some of the ways that you can relate the name Apple to computers? Does anyone have any suggestions about that? Sorry?
Teacher.
Okay, so there's the image of a student bringing an apple for the teacher, sure. So there's a connection, so there's an indirect connection between the name and the idea of education. Also maybe the idea of childlike curiosity. Any other ideas?
Apple falling out of the tree.
Yeah. So there's Newton and the apple falling out of the tree, and the discover sort of a eureka moment about gravity. Yeah. How about others?
Corn dogs.
Corn dog. That was probably
Not intentional. Simplicity.
Simplicity. Say some more about that.
Well, apples are simple. They're just one feature. They're just one simple thing, as opposed to, say, It's just, complementary.
I think it's very interesting.
Passion fruit.
I think it's interesting that you chose another piece of fruit to contrast it with, but I do know what you're saying. It's like, most fruit is pretty simple, but I agree with you. An apple, this is one of my favorite things to say about the name apple. It's like an apple is the ultimate simple thing it's the ultimate simple consumer commodity, right? Then you find them in any grocery store, you go, you buy it, you pick it up, and you take a bite of it. It's just that simple. And remember, Apple Computer was a company that was largely responsible for making computers seem not intimidating, but appealing and desirable and really easy to use. And what's easier to use than an apple, right? You take a bite of it. So the point is that, and it's not when Steve Jobs thought of the name Apple, he did not necessarily think of all these potential connections. It's just that the name Apple came to him, and he sort of thought, it seems to fit. And these connections were probably working in the background, sort of in his subconscious mind. But they were there to be discovered. They were there to be noticed by people. And they're really, they are an important part of the Apple brand. These are all benefits, in this case, of indirect communication in the name Apple. And so indirect communication is really the key for good naming. And everyone should keep it in mind when they're naming their own companies and products. All right. So when you're getting creative with names, then you have to consider, you've decided I don't have $10,000 or even $2,000 maybe to spend on a domain name, so I'm going to have to put it all together. Then you can think about different types of names to use. And so you might take a word and spell it differently, like Flickr, or you might take a couple of words and stick them together, or you might take a word, or what seems like a word, and just kind of tweak it a little bit. Like, that's sort of how I think of the name Zillow, because the illo part seems like it belongs to words we know, like willow and pillow, but where's the Z come from? Or you might try a blend of two different words stuck together. You might try making something up entirely. But the important thing is that you're starting with linguistic elements, and in most cases, they're going to be meaningful, and in most cases, they're going to suggest things to people. And there has to be some important indirect communication going on with those pieces in relation to what you're naming. And that's all I have to say. Does anyone have any comments or questions?